Stanford University.
It's great to be back. Especially great to be back in view of the interest in energy that's bubbling up at Stanford. I'm really excited about all of the aspects of energy that are becoming studied here and the student enthusiasm that goes with it. And so I wish you all the best in improving that energy work here. This, by the way, is the safe harbor statement. Now, my lawyers still require me to show this statement, and this is a certain amount of passive aggressiveness on my part to make it small like that. But there it is. You really should read it. But what it basically, if professors had to do safe harbor statements, it would be something like, there's no guarantee that what I'm teaching you is correct. And even if it is, there's no guarantee you'll learn it. And if you do learn it, there's still no guarantee you'll ever get a job. Okay, so that's the professor's safe harbor statement. Translated into an industry, this is how it comes out. So I'm going to just do a real brief overview of SunPower in the case you haven't heard much about it. We were founded in 1985, and today are active in all areas of the PV market. We had a little over $2 billion in revenue last year, and about 7,000 employees now. This slide's a little bit out of date, and are active. We're the largest residential installer in the U.S., for example, and we're active in all of the markets. The residential market, that's the house on the left, and the commercial market, that's the genuflect to the federal government with a pretty picture of the Washington Monument in it. That's the roof of the Department of Energy, which will be eliminated if Rick Perry gets elected. And maybe we can distribute those panels. And then we do the ground-mounted power plants on the right. As Mike mentioned, SunPower was based on technology that was originally developed here at Stanford in my group, and it's essentially takes all of the electrodes and puts them on the back in an interdigitated form. And I don't want to spend time in this presentation about why that works better and why it's great, but the upshot of it is that produces a very high-performance solar cell. It was a solar cell that for a long time was kind of an oddity. It evolved in the context of concentrating PV systems, where the cost of the cell is not so high. This seems to be on auto. Okay. Where the cost of the cell is not nearly so important. I've given quite a few talks on sort of the long, tortuous path that we had from concentrating PV to where we are today, and so I'm not going to cover that either, except to show a nice picture of typical ground-mounted power plant, which is one of our strength areas, and a typical, not so typical residential type of installation. This is actually an alpine ski hut, and I just show this because I think PV buildings, when they're designed with PV right from the get-go, can be very beautiful and very functional. I've never been there, hope to go there someday. So the talk outline that I'd like to put together today is starting with sort of where we've come from in this field of PV up until the present, where we are now, trying to describe that, and my view about where we're going as an industry, and how we're going to get there, okay? So pretty simple outline. Now, I don't promise that I'll do these all in order necessarily, so, but these are the sort of the thema of my talk. So where we've come from, it's very useful, I think, to understand our industry, to step back to its roots and see what situation was. If we go back to 1975, the way that solar cells were made is pictorially shown on this graph, and it starts on the left with refining silicon, and in fact refining silicon to probably the most pure substance man has ever made, growing it into giant crystals, which were about 3 inches in diameter in 1975, which are some of the most perfect crystals that man has ever made, sawing those into wafers, slicing it on something that looked a bit like a salami slicer, And it's one of the hardest substances you could ever imagine, so that's not particularly easy either. Then turning them into solar cells, laminating them into panels. At that point, you had about $100 per watt embedded in making this thing, okay, in 1975. And when you put a system in, it might have been $200 a watt. So there were people at that time that said, why don't we try and make this into a terrestrial power source? But they obviously had a lot of work ahead of them. This is, it wasn't obvious to most people that you could get here from there, okay? There was just too much cost that had to come out. The history of our industry is really the history of the effort to bring those costs out. And as we did, the market grew quite dramatically. This just is a log plot of the market versus year since, I think, 1978. And when we crossed and built a megawatt of PV for the first time, up until last year, when the industry produced almost 20 gigawatts, 20,000 megawatts of PV. Remember that a typical nuclear power plant unit might be 1 gigawatt, although it produces maybe 3 times as much energy on average on an annual basis as a 1 gigawatt PV plant would. Nevertheless, the industry is arriving at a substantial position right now in the energy infrastructure. This last year, 2010, we produced about 0.4% of the world's electricity, okay, was produced by PV. Doesn't sound like much, but in 2009, it was 0.2%. Because we doubled the industry in that year. We doubled the installed base in 2010 over 2009. And if you go back to 2007, it was 0.1% and just trails off, you know, into nothingness. Going forward is the interesting question. You know, we were 0.4% last year. What's it going to be in the future? Are we going to emerge as a significant supplier of clean energy or not? That's the question. This was driven a lot by government subsidies. The first significant and successful one was the Japanese PV roof program. Prior to that, the thinking in the industry was that you'd build solar farms. Solar cells were thought of for large scale use as a big thing in the desert that would generate electricity and ship it to the city. The Japanese didn't have big deserts, right? So they said, wait a minute, why don't we just put it on people's houses? That was sort of the killer app for PV. It was like, wait a minute, you know, this is the only known resource where you can generate your own power on site easily. Why do we put it in the desert and ship it to the houses? Let's just put it on people's roofs. And that program really jump-started our industry and got it on the track we are today. Others took up on that and followed suit. We had the German renewable energy law, it's called, which instituted a feed-in tariff, really started getting the industry going even further. We have the California Solar Initiative under Governor Schwarzenegger. So this industry finally gathered political support to try and create a new energy source, right? And as we go forward, the big issue that we're facing as an industry today is as we get close to grid parity, meaning as our costs have come down, and I'll show you where they are, to the point that you really don't need too much subsidies. On the other hand, the industry's so big that you do need a lot of subsidy, okay, because it's so big. Is the political will going to be there to sort of create a soft landing? That's the way I look at it. Okay, we want to transition over the next 5 years. Today, you'll see there's grid parity in certain areas like Germany, for example, and Hawaii. 5 years from now, there will be grid parity almost in all of the developed world. Can we get across that chasm with a policy framework that the public will support and that the policymakers can design such that the required funds will be forthcoming from the general public? It's not always been easy, and it's going to level out. So you see that last year we had 100% growth. That's 100% per annum growth at the end there. It hasn't always been like that in our industry. Look back at 1983. You can see an inflection point back there when we were growing quite rapidly, and then the brakes were put on. So that one is really easy to understand. Was the election of Ronald Reagan. He didn't like solar, and he hated it so much that he took the panels that Carter had put, the solar heating panels on the roof of the White House, took them off and threw them away. Okay, so we're going to be going through a similar period now in the future where we're growing less rapidly, but we're making that final transition to cost-effective energy source. The way that we historically have been looking at these costs is in the form of a learning curve. A learning curve is kind of interesting. It plots the price of a panel, in this case PV panel, versus the accumulated amount that has been made up to that point since the beginning of the industry. And this one starts in 1979, where you can see that if your eyes focus like mine don't, $33 a watt was the panel price. That's in current. This was that's in current dollars, 2010 dollars, and it had dropped by 2002 to about $3.65 a watt. So almost a tenfold reduction over that period. This learning curve is kind of historic in SunPower lore. This is the learning curve we put together to raise money to build our factories, and eventually convince Cypress Semiconductor to invest heavily in SunPower. They put $150 million in to help us build a factory. And those little blue dots are what we told Cypress the market price would be going forward. So the learning curve is nice to see how it all came down on a straight line on this log-log plot. This is a log of module price versus a log of cumulative production. Almost all manufactured products will fall on a similar sort of curve. This one has a slope, what we call an experience factor of 81%. That means every time you double the accumulated production, the price is 81% of what it was before you doubled it, okay? Or in other words, the price goes down 19% on every doubling. And it's been doing that since 1979, just inexorably like that. So we said, okay, it's probably going to keep doing it again. And those are those blue dots, okay? That's what we told Cypress would happen. Well, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you what actually happened. Now, you won't see economists do this, and you normally wouldn't see me do it either, except that the ending is kind of interesting. If you go to 2008, we were way above the learning curve. Okay, we had deviated, and this above the learning curve, and this was caused by a shortage of silicon, basically, in our industry. We were growing so fast, we suddenly overtook the chip industry as the largest user of refined silicon, and it took a while for capacity to catch up. That's a very short description of a very chaotic and horrible time, but I won't have too much, I won't talk more about. But it took a while to catch up, and we had this silicon shortage and the price went up. But you can imagine how scary this was, because we had a pact with the regulators around the world that if you supported solar energy, we were going to continue down this learning curve, okay? And when you had to go back and show them this, you've now put how much money into subsidies, and essentially it's been flat, okay, for the last 5 years. Scary times. Well, fortunately, the silicon shortage finally got worked through, capacity was built, and by 2010, we were actually back on the learning curve. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you look at this closely, you can see that the assumed growth before, which was 30%, that's those little blue triangles, would have had the price at $2.20 a watt in 2010. Notice that the price in 2010 was actually $1.81 per watt, okay? But also, the accumulated production was where we thought we would be in 2013. In other words, the market grew a lot faster than 30% per year, and we marched down this learning curve a lot faster than we had intended after we paid all the extortion to get the poly production back in operation again. In fact, it's kind of interesting to look at what was actually spent here. This, if you take the accumulated market every year and just add it up from 2002 to the present, people spent $83 billion worldwide on PV panels during that period. Would have spent that if we had managed to stay on the learning curve, but we didn't. So the question kind of is, how much extra did people have to pay because of this poly shortage? Well, You can figure it out. 17 billion. So because the market was sort of forced to grow so fast, I think there was some inefficiencies in it that forced this. Basically, that's how much money went into building poly capacity worldwide. So you could say this extra bubble was sort of sucked out by the poly manufacturers in order to give us enough capacity rapidly to do that. What if you look a little bit closer? The learning curve actually gives a very nice sort of tapestry to understand the dynamics of this industry. And this is a closer look at the learning curve around the present time. And you can see a projection line there. That's our most recent projection that prior to this year, the blue lines there. And a couple of interesting points are that that projection for 2016, okay, if you just extended the learning curve along its trend line, the 2016 projected price is $1.11, I think that's what it is, or $1.12. That, interestingly enough, is the panel price required to build a power plant in California and meet the so-called market price reference. In other words, if you had a panel that cost $1.12 and make certain assumptions about how much it costs to build a power plant, and then entered into a power purchase agreement with PG&E, they're forced to do that at the so-called market price reference, which, by the way, is not that great. It's about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. There was an interesting article in the New York Times Saturday that claimed that we were paying 18 cents a kilowatt hour. We were getting 18 cents a kilowatt hour for our California Valley Solar Ranch. It legally can't be that. It has to be under the market price reference. I can tell you that it is under the market price reference. But in any case, that is what panels would have to be in that without the investment tax credit. Okay. Now we have a 30% investment tax credit today, so that the owners of the plant can remove 30% of the cost if they have the tax liability to absorb it, and the owner NRG does. That would be that in 2016, when the investment tax credit expires, will no longer be available, we can still build PV plants cost effectively in California if we stayed on this learning curve. Okay, that's the whole chunk. Now the question is, what are some of the other data points on here? Those little green triangles, that's from iSupply, which is an industry service that monitors pricing and supply in the industry closely. And they said not too long ago, last summer, that they thought in 2012 the price would be 99 cents a watt. At the time they said that, it seemed ridiculous, okay, that prices would come down to that low a level by 2012. But suddenly, you'll see in 2011, they're cascading down quite rapidly. They're now down to $1.32 per watt. That will be the average for this year, I suspect. And quite headed towards 99. In fact, this quarter, they're already selling modules for less than 99 cents a watt, and it's clear that in Q1, coming into next year in 2012, modules will hit something like that in price. So we are just zooming back down. And that's the way it is on the learning curve. You go up, you go down, you go up, you attract capital, there's oversupply, you go below the learning curve. If you go back, historically, we've always oscillated, and you can analyze each of those oscillations with a similar kind of thing here. We attracted about double the supply of panels now that the world can absorb. In other words, we have 20 gigawatts of demand this year probably. There's about 40 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity. That's what's dropping the pricing so rapidly. But in any case, it's very obvious kind of looking at this that the idea that you're going to have a $1.12 panel by 2016, which is all that's needed to make power in California without subsidies, seems very doable, right? It just seems like it's going to happen, right? And it will definitely happen. That's sort of my message. There's a new one, a couple of new marks on here. You notice the last one there, the blue X, that's 50 cents a watt. That's the new goal of the U.S. Department of Energy. they decided that what we were doing wasn't quite fast enough for their taste and put a new goal in of 50 cents a watt by 2017. You can see, though, I think that looking at the learning curve, that would require a considerable deviation from the historic learning curve, or a major breakthrough of some kind to get down there. You're just not going to march down that low, that fast. That would just be a huge excursion from the historic learning curve. It would require a major breakthrough. That's what they're trying to do with the program, is precipitate a major breakthrough. So prices have come down. This is where we are. So now I'm at the part of the talk about where we are. Okay, this, for example, shows the cost of energy by various sources according to Lazard. Was updated last summer in June. And you can see this is the levelized cost of energy. It's in dollars per megawatt hour. Now, as a residential consumer, you probably think in dollars per kilowatt hour. So you move the decimal point over 3 places so that $100 a megawatt hour is 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay, but it shows where various energy sources kind of show up on this thing. And you can see, for example, coal is from 7 cents a kilowatt hour to 15 cents a kilowatt hour today, if you were to build a new coal-fired plant. Nuclear, similar range. Combined cycle gas for baseload operation is the lowest cost. Okay, natural gas. And that's come down recently because of the price of natural gas has come down. That used to be higher. But interestingly, the gas peaking plant, okay, that's 21 cents to 24 cents a kilowatt hour. Utilities have to have peaking plants to follow the load variation throughout the day. And those plants are actually producing quite expensive electricity. In fact, they're producing electricity that's more expensive than the renewable sources. Okay? And the renewable sources, like solar especially, are producing power during the day when the utilities have to ramp up their peaking plants to meet air conditioning load in a typical case. Okay. Just a very long-winded way of saying PV is basically here, okay, the top bar. It depends exactly on whether it's ground-mounted at 7.3 cents a kilowatt hour, roof-mounted at 19 cents a kilowatt hour. It's in the hunt. It's not 2 orders of magnitude too expensive like it was in 1978, okay? We're there, okay? Very close. Now, this includes the 30% investment tax credit. If you take that out, it moves things over a little bit to the right. But it's still only 30%, and we're pulling cost out sufficiently fast that it's very clear that in a few years we'll get that 30% back out. In fact, it almost has been, because this was done last summer when pricing was quite a bit higher than it is today. So we're darn at the precipice, man. I mean, PV is basically right there after all these years of hard work. As a result, markets are projected to go up. This is from the EPIA, the European Photovoltaics Industry Association, their projection of where the markets are going to go. And you see the 15.5 gigawatts that they estimate, others are quite a bit higher in 2011. I mean, in 2010, they're seeing 2011 is actually down slightly. Okay, so this will be the first year, if that comes to pass, where the markets are down, basically because of the financial turmoil in Europe. But they see it coming right back in a big way because costs are coming down so fast, okay? And so it's just working through this issue of the subsidy programs in Europe that have nurtured our industry to the size it is today and weaning ourselves off them, and how that happens that is sort of the critical cog in this whole thing. You can see the EU is the blue bar, dropping quite a bit this year versus last year as the subsidy programs get rationalized and worked on. Here's another interesting slide. This shows the added capacity in the European Union in 2009. And 2010 is, I don't have the data yet, but it'd be way more dramatic than this because it doubled. Okay, but this is the added capacity in the European Union in 2009, and there's wind, natural gas, and PV. Those are the first three. And you can see they are larger than coal, which added 2.4 gigawatts and retired 3.2 gigawatts. So coal was a net negative in the European Union. You go along there, biomass, blah, blah, blah. Nuclear is retiring. They retired that year. They're going to continue retiring in the European Union. So all of the new capacity that's happening in Europe is a trio of wind, PV, and solar. This is a theme, I think, that you will see going forward for the entire Earth. We're going to see switching to wind, PV, and solar. Wind, natural gas, and solar, I'm sorry. Wind, natural gas, and PV. How about that? Okay. We're going to be switching to that, and one reason is that natural gas is less polluting than coal. It also allows you more easily to build a power plant that can follow the load variations as sun goes up and down. You can ramp a natural gas power plant more quickly in general than you can a coal or nuclear plant. So it matches with these variable sources like wind and solar. So pretty remarkable, don't you think? I mean, if you were to ask the typical person on the street, you know, what was the most energy production of new capacity, I don't think you'd find many people that would say, oh, well, it was wind and natural gas and solar, right? But it's true. It's happening. Here's another interesting slide. This is the feed-in tariff in Europe. And the black line is Germany. In Germany, the way it works there, you put a panel on your roof, you sell power to the utility, they pay you for it, and they pay you have 2 meters in, one for what you use and one for what you sell, and they pay you a lot more for what you sell historically. So you can see that this is euro cents. You know, you go back in 2008, you could make 45 euro cents per kilowatt hour selling PV. It was a gold rush. I mean, that's why Germany is like half the world market. And they realized it was too generous and started ratcheting it down. And so coming out of 2011, it's like 22 euro cents per kilowatt hour. It's going down another 15% from that Q1 of 2012, okay? Another 15%. It's really going down. In fact, interestingly, it is so far down that it's below the retail rate in Germany, okay? People are still going to be putting PV on their houses because it makes sense. Germany's got expensive electricity, and you can do called self-use in Germany. So if you need the power, you can use it, and if you don't need the power, you sell it to the utility at the feed-in tariff. If you have to buy power, you buy it at the retail rate. Okay, it will still pencil out with the pricing that has come down so fast in PV. We're going to see a wonderful market in Germany next year. My prediction. And this is non-subsidized market basically, right? The utility's buying it back for less than they're selling it to. You know, we could get into a lot of discussion on whether that really is a subsidy or not, but it's huge progress by any measure. This is a slide that shows that in a different way by our friends at Q-Cells, another manufacturer. And it shows the price of electricity on the horizontal axis versus how many kilowatt hours per square meter per day solar insolation that location gets. And each country's on there. You can see all the countries. The difference in color is commercial buildings are blue and residential buildings are orange. Germany is I wonder if this is, yeah. Germany is this guy here. Germany has high electricity rates, so there's that 23 euro cents that I was talking about, above the feed-in tariff. And so it's sort of straddling where it's cost-effective. All the bubbles on this side of this line don't need subsidies anymore to make PV practical in that application. And obviously, as the price comes down, this thing moves over like that. But Germany just got swept into it. In the United States, Hawaii is in there. This is mostly European Union type stuff here. So basically, one of the things we've been able to do in our industry is make cost projections of where we'll be, sell that to regulators, and make good on our promise. And they generally have always come true. There was an interesting thing called the NREL roadmap meeting in 2002, the National Renewable Energy Lab. we put together a group of experts at a silicon workshop with the goal of predicting what we could do going into the future. And that was in 2002. We looked at all of the parameters of making a solar cell, how much silicon cost, how thick the wafers were, what the manufacturing yield was, how much it cost to do the diffusion, you know, how much it cost to laminate it. We worked on all those. I'm not going to go through the whole roadmap workshop, but interestingly, back then wafers were 320 microns thick, okay, and we predicted they'd come down this curve here over time. This was done by consensus, taking the average of 30 experts' opinions. And this is where they came out, and shows just our actuals versus that. You can see that we've been right on the NREL predictions coming down. This shows the predicted, out of that workshop, predicted module price versus year, okay? Notice that we predicted that modules would be $1 a watt, and this is the manufacturing cost of the module, not the sales price, that they would cost $1 a watt to manufacture in 2012. This is what actually happened. We actually beat that projection. And this is a projection of a bunch of starry-eyed industry enthusiasts, right, which were mostly discounted by others. But we actually beat it. $1 a watt today is the standard module manufacturing cost. This is just another one. It shows you a trend line that was put together in 2006. This is from a typical slide, the talks that I gave in 2006, and had that little orange trend line going down there. Notice that in 2010 it predicted $1.82 a watt for module price, and we actually hit $1.81 in 2010. So it's just kind of funny. I'm just showing you this because I think the industry understands its cost structures, is able to project where we're going to be going, how we're going to do it, and get there, just like we are as we go forward. This just shows the cost of power versus the California market price reference. That's what PG&E buys renewable power for, which is not subsidized in my view. It's actually quite a low cost when you look at your utility bill and what you pay if you do time of use rates, for example. And considering that solar comes mostly during the end of the day, or during the day. But in any case, you can see that the projected price for PV is coming down. Now it's in below the market price reference, and certainly is going to stay there. So this shows the Q-Cell slide, their projections for 2016, 5 years from now. It shows how many more countries have been swept into the it's cost effective to put PV on your roof category, okay? Translate in no more need for subsidies, okay? So it's happening. So how do we go forward from here? That's sort of, I think, the big $24,000 question. This is all just background. The best way to do it, the way we think about it anyway, is to look at the value chain. And this shows the silicon value chain that I had up before, only with pretty colors this time, going from polysilicon all the way through to power plants. Grow ingots, slice wafers, make cells, make panels, power plant, okay? But it's much more interesting to replot this thing, not with little abstract blocks all the same size, but replot it with the blocks being proportional to the cost at those points, okay? And this is very instructive. This is something that anybody who's serious about working in this industry and making changes really has to internalize completely, because lack of understanding of this structure here has caused innumerable problems. For example, look at this. Silicon is often considered the bugaboo in the whole thing, but in fact, this expensive silicon is only 12% of the total system cost, okay, when you look at costs. Growing it into an ingot is even less, 6%. Slicing it into a wafer is 9%. If you add those all up, that's 15 plus 12, or 27%. So 27% of making a PV power plant is tied up in just getting a silicon wafer ready to turn into a solar cell, right? Now, think about it. Suppose you had a free wafer, okay? Somebody came up with a way to make the wafer free. What's that going to do? at most. It pulls 27% out of the power plant, right? You just made these all free right here. Pulls out 27%. Suppose also that they think that's so important that it doesn't matter if the efficiency is, doesn't matter what the efficiency is. Suppose you reduce the efficiency by 27 relative percent by using a lower cost wafer. What have you done? You got nothing, right? You got the same structure out there. It costs 27% less, but it produces 27% less energy, okay? So you have to really be careful as you slice through this. This is the problem that SunPower's original product, concentrators, got stuck on. Look at this, after you make the cell, it's 41%. So it'd be nice to concentrate sunlight and use much less cell area, okay? But most you're going to do is reduce the system price by 41% by concentrating, because there's no way you're going to build a module that's cheaper, the concentrating module cheaper than a standard flat panel module, and no way that you can put the system in cheaper, as cheap as a standard flat plate system. So, but if you concentrate, you off the top lose 25% of the light right out of the get-go, okay? Most of the advantage you got by shrinking the cell, because you can't collect the diffuse light from the sky. You can only collect light from the sun. Look at, try this own calculation on an applied materials sun fab. Okay, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Which produces 6% panels, and see where you get, okay? Got a 6% panel instead of a panel that's nearly 3 times as efficient, but all you've done is attack this part of the value chain right here, okay? So, anyway, moving on. What we do, everyone who works in this field sort of has their own map through this value chain. SunPower's view is to concentrate on efficiency and work on making the cell more efficient. Maybe it's more expensive, but it impacts all of the others by producing more power. So for example, if it costs us twice as much to make the cell, this 14 becomes 28, right? So the whole value chain becomes 114 instead of 100%. But if we produce more than 14% more output, we win. Okay, so that's our strategy. Everyone's got their own strategy when they look at this and try and figure it out. But you have to figure out a strategy that makes sense in view of these numbers. By the way, this was done over 2 years ago, and the total cost at that point was $263 a watt. It's way, way less than that now. So our approach has been to increase efficiency, and we've been doing that in the laboratory. We have 24% efficient cells now in pilot production. This shows a panel that's almost 21% made with those types of cells that is also in pilot production now. But also we want to work on everything else. One of the things is the silicon solar cell is uses way more silicon than it really needs to. Okay, and we've been using less and less as we thin it down. But this just shows the efficiency of a cell versus its thickness. And you can see that even if the thickness is down to 25% or 25 microns, a fraction of the 140 that's used today, you still get pretty good cell out of it, right? So you can thin the cell down quite a bit, and we've been working on that. Now, this is another myth that is very important to understand. This shows the cost of the silicon in a solar cell, okay? This happens to be a 23% cell for us, so it's a little less than for a lower performance cell. But today, the ingot costs around about $100 a kilogram, right? That's what we pay, give or take, right? And we use about 5 grams per watt of that silicon ingot that we buy. Now that, to make a watt, 5 grams of silicon to make 1 watt, it's actually less than that now. And if you do the math, that's 50 cents a watt. So right now, 50 cents a watt is tied up in just the silicon ingot in a solar cell. Well, it turns out that the prices are coming down, and in fact, the $50 a kilogram is happening now, half that. And if you use only 100 microns of silicon, that turns out to be 1 gram per watt. That's 5 cents a watt. Okay. So it's fallacious to say that expensive silicon is the problem. Okay? It's not the problem. The problem is figuring out how to make a cell thin enough to realize these kinds of numbers. So you either want to work on that problem, how do you make a cell using less silicon, or you could work on another approach like a thin film approach. So we have a roadmap. This shows the pricing that has been coming down. One of the biggest, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go faster. But one of the biggest breakthroughs that's happened is another one that came out of the blue. One of the first big breakthroughs in bringing that cost down, that 100-fold that I showed on that first slide, was wire saws. Wire saws replaced the saw that sawed wafers off one at a time. They were called ID saws. Wire saws, a modern wire saw saws about 4,000 wafers at once. It uses a wire that came from the automotive industry for making radial tires, and it's about as long as the distance from here to Los Angeles is wound up in the wire saw, and a slurry is put on, and you slaw these things. It dramatically reduced the cost. And by the way, it's the only instance of a technology development that went from PV back to ICs. Okay, IC industry said this is so great, we're going to adopt wire saws, and they had to adopt it for the 12-inch wafers. That was the only way to saw them. So most of the technologies have gone the other way. From IC, we've borrowed them. We have that one to show that we gave back. But and if you go back to that cost, you can see the wire sawing is, it's wafering, that's what that yellow is only 9% anyway. But there's a new wire sawing technique that it's called fixed abrasive or diamond wire sawing that essentially halves the cost right out of the get-go. Mainly because the cutting speed is twice as fast, and because it doesn't consume the slurry of silicon carbide, and it doesn't create the waste stream of contaminated with ethylene glycol, et cetera, et cetera. Dramatic improvement. So every one of these points along the value chain is being attacked, and some of them are yielding quite impressive results. Wire sawing is one that will be coming on to production levels pretty soon. In any case, the cost is rapidly coming down this is our SunPower's internal roadmap here. But what's the next step? What could you really do? One approach that people are talking about is simply to bond a thin piece of silicon, less than, say, 100 microns thick, less than the thickness of a piece of paper, on the back of glass, and then make the solar cell on that piece. It becomes almost like a thin film cell. The question is, how do you get these thin pieces of silicon and that would use very little material? But in any case, if you could get them, you can see silicon getting to something like 60 cents a watt. Okay, in terms of manufacturing cost. That's our roadmap, and and I think it's pretty clear that it's going to happen. This I like to have fun with the Sunshot program. This shows the goals that DOE has for solar, that they put this Sunshot program together for. Shows pricing in 2004. This is for a complete system. Shows pricing, their estimate of today, 2010. This is already, they have the module price here. This is module, inverter, and everything else. Module at $1.70, so this has obviously been blown through quite substantially, but that was their estimate. The current goal for 2016, they put here at $1.05, 12 or 13 or something, and 97 cents for everything else, about $2 a watt for the complete system. It's very clear we're going to blow through that much more quickly. But their ambitious goal is to get to 50 cents a watt modules and $1 a watt for a complete system by 2017. That's the DOE program has been structured around trying to make that happen. As a result, they didn't think that silicon could get there. This is their view of what silicon could do. 2010, standard cell. 2015, selective emitters were going to come in. 2020, all rear contacts. Okay. 2030, ultra-thin wafers. Okay. That's the DOE goal. And their estimate was that they'd only get to 73 cents a watt for sales price by 2030. Well, I'm sorry. But, for example, we do all rear contacts now, and we think that the thin wafer concept can come in by 2017. And our cost estimates are very close to what they have here, 60 cents a watt, as I said, right here, sales price of 73 cents a watt. But because the efficiency is so high, we get an efficiency credit of something like this, which brings us below the DOE goal for a SunPower-based system in 2017. So that's what we're about right now. And some of the ways to do this are continuous crystal growth. I'm not going to have time to talk about this. Or direct cleaving of wafers, where instead of sawing wafers, you peel them off in some way, either by an ion implanted layer that creates a stress region, or other ways. There's a number of companies out there that are working on how to get thin peeled wafers to make solar cells out of. There's Astrowatt in Austin, Texas, which has a marvelous way of just peeling wafers off an ingot. Okay, you wouldn't believe you could do it, but you can. Crystal Solar here in Silicon Valley, Selexol here in Silicon Valley, they're both looking at epitaxial ways of doing it. So we have three competing technologies out there to create this magical thin wafer, which is going to get us the 60 cent a watt, right? We have the ion implanted stress, we have Astrowatt's peeled wafers, and there's others doing these same things, by the way, and epitaxial wafers. We're rooting for them. You also have to get the balance of system cost down. And it doesn't do to just get the module down. You have to get everything else down with it. And there's a lot of creative work. This is one area where I think the Department of Energy is spot on. They're emphasizing working on balance of system costs. And this is the first time, really, where they've had this kind of emphasis. This is from their Sunshot report. It just shows what's happened to agriculture. These are harvesters, wheat harvesters, that just rip through a wheat farm and harvest it really quickly. And the vision is that instead of harvesting wheat, they'd be planting solar panels in the ground as they go along. Okay? So somebody's going to do this. In fact, it's already happening in Germany. These harvesters are not owned by the farmer because the harvest season starts first in the south of the U.S. and moves up to Canada. And so the harvesters travel north and harvest people's farms. So you can imagine the same thing where harvesters are going all over the country planting solar farms in the desert. So let me just finish with, how close we are and what can stop us. This is an interesting example. I could talk about this for all day, okay? But this is one interesting example. This is from a book that purports to show that PV can't possibly be an energy source, okay? It's called Power Hungry. And the argument is, by this guy, that the area required for PV is just way too great, okay? So look at the bottom. It says 6.7 watts per square meter is what PV generates, okay? And I said, where did he get this? And he referenced it, and it came from somebody from the Heritage Foundation who didn't reference it either, okay? And so the trail went cold. You know, a SunPower panel produces 200 watts per square meter peak. On average, it produces a third that on a tracking system. So I don't know where you get 6.7 watts per square meter. But the bizarre thing is here that nuclear, and this is where I think the nuclear, so he was promoting nuclear. Nuclear is only 56 watts a square meter, okay? It's about twice what a PV plant is. It takes about twice as much area to build a PV plant as a nuclear plant. I don't see that as a big impediment, basically. The reason the nuclear plant's so big is they have to have an exclusion zone around it, okay? I'm trusting he got the nuclear one right. I didn't go in and look at it. Now, this normally you would say, oh, okay, this guy, you know, he's doing his noise and we don't need to pay any attention to it. So this is the review from the Wall Street Journal. A brilliant exploration, unsentimental, unsparing, impassioned precisely the kind of journalism we need to hold truth to power, okay? That's the kind of journalism we need. Or the National Review should be mandatory reading for U.S. policymakers. Of course, this was sent to all U.S. policymakers. So there's this constant barrage of PV can't do it, PV can't do it, PV can't do it, okay? You probably know who's funding all of this. I won't say. So as you go out, you have to be advocates, in my view. You will face a lot of doubters out there. PV is too small to matter and always will be, so forget it, okay? 0.4% now, going to be 20% in 10 years or so. Okay, be significant. And in 20 years, remember, a nuclear power plant in the US takes 16 years to permit and build. So by the time you could build a new nuclear power plant, PV will already be supplying 20 or 30% of the US power. PV is too expensive and require massive subsidies, okay? I spent a good deal of time on that. It did require subsidies. It's right there now. Takes up too much valuable land. I showed you the plot on that. It doesn't, okay? Twice nuclear. PV will make the grid unstable. I didn't have time to talk about that, but that's erroneous too. With proper work with our utility friends, it won't. And green jobs are a myth. You see this concept. Well, there's 100,000 in the US right now. SunPower employs, well, we have 1,500 dealers, each with about 10 people. You do the math. And we have 1,500 employees, direct employees in the US. So if you look at the whole industry, it's well over 100,000 employees at this point. So with that, I charge you up and thank you very much for your attention.
Can we have some students to ask questions first?
So, according to what you show, it looks like industry is just marching down the cost curve, and I'm not going to say that there's no innovation needed, but it looks like standard cost reduction measures will get us where we need to be in 15 years. So, where do you see opportunities for people in academia who want to work on solar?
Well, I think the more research, the better. I mean, you know, to me, anybody working in PV should get a medal of some kind. And there's so many things you can do in PV. I think, ironically, you know, on the one hand, the rapid price reductions that we've seen have made it difficult for new technologies to make it into the market because of the scale issue. I mean, today, a 1 gigawatt factory is an average kind of factory to build if you're building a solar module manufacturing company. It's hard to build a pilot line that can compete with that. So that's made it difficult. On the other hand, the slower growth that we're going to see going forward, instead of growing 100% per year, it could be 20, is going to slow down this process and I think eventually open up opportunities for a new technology, which would have been very difficult to conceive of if we had just been ramping down this learning curve so extremely fast. In other words, learning curves make a moving target for new technologies. That's always been the problem. I mean, it was, my first job was at HP, and I was assigned to work on silicon on sapphire, which had all kinds of advantages over silicon. And we convinced ourselves that it was going to take over, right? But in fact, the cost of standard silicon just kept coming down so fast we could never make it, right? And so there's a similar sort of thing going on here. But I think when the industry slows a little bit, there's opportunities for new and other innovative technologies. I also think that there's tremendous opportunities in the mainstream value chain. You have to realize the global budget for R&D here is quite large. I mean, you know, you can say, well, it's not innovative, but you know, if you say the total market for PV modules alone, last year 20 gigawatts times 2, say, dollars, so that's $40 billion, and say 10% of that would be $4 billion, but it's only 5%, so $2 billion. There's probably something on the order of $2 billion a year in R&D going on in this industry, right? I mean, it's real R&D. It's not just tweaking this little thing and that. So there's a lot of activity that's making this happen, both in the mainstream as well as in newer technologies that potentially could come along.
You talked only about silicon. What about thin film technologies? Are they competing or not?
Well, yeah, thin film, there's one company that sort of got through in the early days here before it became difficult and the industry exploded, and that's First Solar, which has a cadmium telluride-based technology and has been extremely successful. They're the largest PV company on the planet. Okay, so I talked about silicon because that's what I do. They're very, very successful. I think in the view of a lot of people, it's remarkable that silicon's been able to compete at all with First Solar. But in fact, we do quite nicely, mainly because our efficiencies are higher. But for everyone else that kind of was a few years behind, First Solar, by the way, was incorporated in 1984. Okay, so that was a year before SunPower. So these guys have been around. They paid their dues. They were called Glass Tech and then Solar Cells Inc. But they paid their dues and they got it working, and they made it in a big way. For others trying to imitate that, it's tough because I think First Solar can set the pricing in that module efficiency range, and they're always going to be the low-cost leader for a long time in the future, in my view, in the 11% efficiency module range, which is where most thin films aspire to be. It's not to say that there will be other thin film companies that can play in that, but I don't see them. They're going to have a difficult time dealing with First Solar at the 11% efficiency range. Now, if somebody can come up with an efficiency that's closer to a standard silicon solar cell and get the price premium that garners, okay, which is considerable. I mean, for example, SunPower, with our 20% module, last year got we got about a 50 cent a watt price premium over a standard panel, okay, just because it was higher efficiency. And so if somebody could get First Solar-like prices per square meter, but get crystalline solar-like efficiencies, they maybe could really do something if they can get through that manufacturing chasm of getting a pilot large enough and then building a big enough, because you're not going to be able to do it with a 50 megawatt factory. You're going to have hundreds of megawatts of capacity to get costs to what I said, which is lower than crystalline silicon at crystalline silicon efficiencies. But I mean, it's been a long wait for the other thin film companies, but there's a few of them that they're right there. It could break through.
Is Cylinder dead?
The courts think so. So did the politicians, which was a disaster. Yes.
Do you feel solar got its fair share of DOE research money compared to gas, nuclear, and coal historically, today, and why?
Well, I don't know. I think, DOE has been buffeted about. The best DOE programs were like the Solar America Initiative, which we thought was quite well structured and quite generous. That was under the Bush administration. So you never know. But certainly, if the U.S. were really serious about creating a sustainable, renewable, non-fossil fuel-based power system, we didn't put enough money in. I mean, you can't. I mean, when you look at the charts of fossil fuel subsidies. By the way, the fossil fuel subsidies globally are $1 billion a day. So there's like a handful of industries that garner the famous $1 billion a day club in terms of government subsidies, and fossil fuels is one of them, and agriculture is another. And so, we pale in comparison with the subsidies that have gone into the oil and gas industry. But I don't want to say that. I think it's been pretty good. The problem in the U.S. has been lack of enthusiasm I think. It's, if you compare, for example, the US with China, China is embracing photovoltaics in a big way, and I think sees that as an industry of the future for them, rightly so, and intends to become a leader in that field, and is, the dynamic you can build a factory in China to make solar cells, in 6 months, where it would take a year or two in the United States, just because they're so fired up about it. And so I think it's a lack of understanding of the potential of this industry to be one of the major industries in the future going forward on the part of the U.S. If that understanding were there, then the government, however, would figure out ways to help it happen. There's a lot of ways you could do it. You're certainly not going to put venture-type money into startups like they did most recently. That's not going to happen again in the U.S. So, but I don't. The political dialogue just is not there when you have the major candidates all saying things like global warming is the greatest hoax perpetrated on man. And then you have the Chinese saying, well, that's, there's a bunch of engineers and scientists in the Chinese government, and they understand how serious it is. They don't have this problem that we do. Yeah.
How important to the future of the PV industry do you think the market price of natural gas is?
I think it's irrelevant, pretty much, because I see a partnership between natural gas and PV and wind that is evolving right now, where those will be the three sources, and natural gas will be used as a buffer to make up the variability that's inherent in wind and solar. The amount of natural gas needed to do that over time is a very complex thing. Some people say, well, we need storage. Okay, so natural gas, in a way, is competing with storage right now, because it's making up the difference. Instead, we're not storing it; we're just burning fossil fuels. Right now, that's way cheaper than any storage opportunity on the horizon. But fundamentally, storage and natural gas are in competition. Long-distance transmission, like HVDC, that could lower the cost of shipping power all over the country, that's in competition with it, because the more you aggregate regions, the more the variable resources are less variable. It's sunny, might be sunny here, but cloudy there, and so we ship power there. Right now, you can only do that over hundreds of miles instead of the whole continent. And so HVDC and the whole smart grid is sort of a part of the mix. Exactly how natural gas, storage, HVDC play out will be done in the marketplace. But those are sort of the contenders to complement wind and solar, in my view.
It's hard to pick.
Do you see limitations on the adaptability of solar power based on grid limitations?
Yeah, there certainly is. It's a very complicated thing, and fortunately, the utilities are interested in this and are working hard on it. Again, it's sort of the same cast of characters. Storage can help stabilize the grid. So can long-distance transmission. So can natural gas peaking plants, and so can demand-side management, which is another thing that's in competition with this whole thing. The smart grid, where they'll turn off your wash machine if they need the power, in the middle of the night, and turn it back on for you. You won't even know. So all of those modern sort of things that are emerging in the utility sector are important to get to play here. And where you really need it is probably when you reach 20% power. For example, Germany, I had a slide I should have put in, but I took it out because there was too many slides. But Germany, I think it was May 6th last year, produced more wind and solar than the country could use on its ISO, on its essentially power markets, and had to ship power out of the country. But but that's the first time that that's happened. Fortunately, Germany is well connected to other regions around it and could do that. But that's Germany's way ahead of us with 20%, PV. So that's sort of where it starts happening, and how we deal with it, I think it'll be exciting, and it's going to be a mixture of all these things: smart grid, demand-side management, storage, peaking plants, and everyone will have their own formula, and it'll all get worked out, I think. But it used to be. I'm quite confident because when we first started, when I got into solar in 1975, I think I was reading like a Mother Earth magazine, about it, and there was some guy in New York that put PV on and tried to hook it to the grid, and they said you can't do it. We generate power, you don't generate power, and so he disconnected his house from the grid. Then they started charging him for being disconnected, and I mean it was just and then when we first started putting significant PV in California, at 1%, it was like, oh God, the grid's going to go ballistic when you get 1% of non-dispatchable stochastic sources on the grid. Anybody that was a real utility person knew that was baloney, because there's that much of non-predictable load. You don't call your utility up every time you turn your air conditioner on and say, may I please turn on my air conditioner, right? You just turn it on and they deal with it. Well, PV is kind of the same, only it's negative. It's like you turned your air conditioner off. They deal with it. Question is, they can deal with that at 1%, but then they said, but in California, we're going to have to cap it at 5%. And 2% was, the first cap, and because the grid's going to go unstable. And then we got to 2%, and the political forces were such, Schwarzenegger was in the office, that we managed to get the cap raised, and the grid didn't go unstable, and we got to 5%, the grid's still not unstable, and Hawaii's got areas that are at 20 and 30%. They're dealing with these problems now, but it's a very nice microcosm of learning of how you deal with high penetrations of PV. They're very motivated to do it because they're all on diesel, right, and very expensive power. But the utilities were initially very conservative, very reluctant. They were rightly very concerned about reliability of the grid, and but they've been backing up, and I think the forward-thinking people within the industry now embrace PV along with all these other things that I mentioned, which will help create sort of the utility of the future. Smart grids, storage, long-distance HVDC transmission, other types of transmission, demand-side management, that kind of thing. And so I think it's clear. It's not clear exactly how far you can go in that direction, but I think you can get to 40% PV, 40% wind, and 20% natural gas. By 2050 or 2060. That's sort of my guess, and that's where we'll really need it, because that's where people say that we really got to watch out for CO2 emissions. So I think it's all doable.
For the more recent cost declines, how much of that was really due to cost coming down versus margins coming down?
Right. So the gross margin now is about zero for many manufacturers. If you put two and two together, I showed you that the manufacturing cost is $1 a watt, and on a previous slide, 10 slides before, the sales price is $1 a watt, right? So yes, a lot of it is coming out of the profits of the industry, and that's why the industry needs something like a 20% gross margin to be a healthy industry, and so the price is probably going to stabilize while we flush this inventory out. Right now, there's a lot of excess inventory in the system, and that's going to get flushed out. You certainly are not going to see a sustainable industry with 70 cents a watt for a while. Okay, but it's very clear we're going to get to that number, that $1.16 it was, or $1.12, to make a subsidy-free market in the U.S. with reasonable gross margins on manufacturing cost.
Yes, as you're an educator, I would ask you, SunPower is doing a California Solar Schools program.
Yeah.
And I think this is interesting, especially for debunking your myths that you just heard there. And Germany apparently is also going this direction, where they're requiring curriculum in Germany for teaching students K through 12 a certain amount of photovoltaic knowledge that they will have. They're required to have that in schools now. If we had the same thing occur in California, what are the kinds of topic areas as an educator, what would you like to see in the school curriculum program if we came to that?
Oh man, finally somebody threw a difficult question at me. I think people, I think people don't understand energy in general. I mean, the general public doesn't understand energy. And I think energy literacy is what I would really strive for, what it is, what energy is, where we get it from, and how we use it. Those are the key things. And just to illustrate how illiterate it is, for example, if you read the newspaper, they'll always mix the units up, right? And it's sort of like a reporter has this bag with like energy units in it, and he comes along, oh my God, and just sort of sticks one in, at random, because he has no clue. Or when we talk to somebody about we talk to the press about a new power plant, we say, well, we just built this 10 megawatt Alamos power plant, and the reporter's eyes kind of go around like this, and he says, well, we really don't understand what 10 megawatts is. Could you tell us how many houses it powers? So the unit of energy has become the house, okay? The house, sort of de facto. Or another, another good example is when the newspaper talks about rate increases from PG&E, okay? They say PG&E is requesting a rate increase, okay? And this will result in the average consumer spending 24 cents a month more. That's how they express it. They don't say 3% of the kilowatt hour. It's just you're going to have to spend 24% for the average customer. Whereas if you look at like gasoline, when the price of gas goes up, the paper doesn't feel compelled to say the average driver is going to spend, $4 a month more because the price of gas went up. You say, no, it went up 10 cents a gallon. People understand 10 cents a gallon. They don't understand kilowatt hours. And they don't understand what it's used for, where it comes from, how much it is. They don't understand how energy addicted we are, how energy intensive we are. I mean, a good example, there was a guy that lectures about this, a VC actually, and he pointed out that a joule, which is the fundamental unit of energy, right, in the new SI units, is about the amount of energy to take an apple from the floor and put it up here on this table. It's a Newton meter. That's 1 joule, right? Okay. That's tangible. If everybody understood that's energy, the apple, put it up there. A kilowatt hour, okay? What's a kilowatt hour? Well, I mean, that's a strange unit that has historic, it is a rate times the time, undoing it, right? Okay, so a kilowatt, so a watt is 1 joule per second. So you lift an apple up so now you're doing a watt, 1 per second. Okay, you can do a watt of work, work at a watt rate pretty easily. What's a kilowatt hour? Well, I'll do the math for you. It's 3.6 million joules, okay, right? So for which we pay 10 cents. So we pay 10 cents to lift 3.6 million joules from the floor to the table. That's how much energy, think if you had to pay somebody to do that, how much, so we've got energy all through our society, from making fertilizer to grow more agriculture, to plowing the fields with tractors, to transporting it in refrigerated trucks to the market, to refrigerating it at the grocery store. Amazing amount of energy embedded in that whole thing. And that's the kind of thing I think people need to understand, rather than what photons coming into silicon and kind of thing.
Well, I think a lot of us would like to stay and talk for a while longer, but he's agreed to meet with some of the students now. So let's thank him again for an excellent.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.